Thank you for tuning in to the Logic of God podcast. I'm Cody.
I'm Gina.
And I'm Ben.
If you're returning, thank you for coming back. And if you are a new guest, welcome.
So Genesis 39, it's an interesting bookend here. So we started with Joseph having dreams, then we skipped to Judah, now we're back to Joseph, and what happened after he was sold.
And we also get to see how Joseph handles a situation with sexual immorality as opposed to Judah.
And even his ancestors, because we know with Abraham and Isaac that they pretended their wives were their sisters in Egypt.
The people of his, like Abraham and Abraham's descendants, seem to have a really bad time with Egypt.
I don't know if I would agree because they got rich, filthy rich.
And then they got poor, filthy poor. But then they got rich, filthy rich again.
Yeah.
And then the Pharaoh drowned.
Poor Pharaoh. So now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, and Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. And he made him overseer of his house, and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house, and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge. Because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. So, Potiphar, our newest addition to our character plot.
Yeah, who's this guy?
He's the captain of the guard, of course.
Yeah. Apparently this was like a name like John or Steve. Everybody had it.
A dime a dozen, these Potiphars are all over the place.
So his name means the one whom Ra, which is the Egyptian sun god, has given. Find it very interesting that Joseph is working for somebody that the sun has given after his dream. Anyway, So the Lord was with Joseph. This is a point that stands out to me because for a civilization as mystical as the Egyptians were, I find it surprising that they would notice that God was with Joseph. And my question would be, how did Potiphar know? Some people would say, a lot of the teachings say, oh, it's just the work of his hands were so successful. He was just really good at everything. But I don't agree. So I want to know what you guys think.
I would say that no matter what, that's definitely a part of it, because the Bible does say that God blessed him so that whatever he did succeeded. And that's at multiple stages of his life. But I do think that there is more to it than that. And I think we can even pull from just general modern day experiences. We tend to be able to tell when God is really with someone. It's not just in success or failure. It's in part the way they approach life. It's in the way they approach hardship. It's the way they approach other people. But it's also something intangible. It's hard to explain. But I think we've all met someone who you're around them and there's almost this aura. I hate the word, but there's like something. And I see in the outline you touch on this, but it's not even necessarily something visible, I would say. Like for some characters, figures in the Bible, it is visible. I think we worship a God of both the visible and the invisible, and there's definitely something. Like it's interesting that in the next couple chapters, Pharaoh asks if there is someone for whom the Ruach Elohim, the Spirit of God, dwells on. And that is Joseph. And I think the thing that shows that God is with him is the fact that the Spirit of God rests with him and on him, and people can feel and see that.
I think when you take into consideration the fact that Joseph was a slave, like historically during that time, just based on imagery from like hieroglyphics and stuff, we know that slaves basically wore like a loincloth. So you have this man who's got, he used to wear this beautiful long coat, and now he's stripped into nothing but like a loincloth. And thinking through the kind of trust that you and I would get in a workplace setting. You're starting out in a workplace making maybe minimum wage and you work your way up. You don't just start out as the boss. And so there had to have been a significant number of times that Joseph was successful in bigger and bigger ways in order for Potiphar to be like, okay, fine. You are ultimately like my equal in my household as a slave. And that was not unheard of back then, but it certainly wasn't common for a slave to be elevated to that power of authority over and over in escalating ways. So I feel like that in and of itself is remarkable and worth bringing up. But then thinking through the signs, it reminded me so much of the way I describe Cody when he's in the zone with God, which is this glow. And it's not that he like suddenly lights up like a neon sign. It's just this subtle thing, like you mentioned, like an aura. And it's a radiance that kind of comes from within. And there's even like jokes with pregnant women. Oh, you're glowing. That's how I could tell that you were pregnant. And like with new life, if you look at a video on YouTube of a human egg being fertilized, there's a flash of light that happens before. So the sperm meets the egg. There's a flash of light when they become one. And that's when life begins. And there's this like life affirming light that comes from God, good and perfect things that come from God, wisdom and righteousness that come from God. And I think that may have been something that Potiphar and others saw in Joseph and why they trusted him so much. I put a lot of examples of radiance in here, not just because it was like a physically visible radiance, but also because we know, just based on many places in the Bible and ancient texts, that the radiance meant something. And so I can share if you want, but we don't have to.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I like those.
So Moses glowed after being in the presence of God. The priestly blessing in Numbers 6:25, may the Lord make his face shine upon you. Then we have the transfiguration with Jesus where he was radiant. In Acts, Stephen's face shone like an angel when he was being killed. In Ecclesiastes 8:1, it says, a man's wisdom makes his face shine. And then in the Midrash, as well as Genesis, Jacob's face shone after wrestling Christ. In First Enoch, it says, the righteous will shine like the lights of heaven. This is extra biblical. So the wisdom of Solomon 3:7 says, the righteous will shine forth and run like sparks through the stubble. The Testament of Abraham says that Abraham's face shines like the sun at his death. Testament of Job says that Job's daughters received cords from heaven and their faces shined like the sun. Then the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's 3 instances where it says that people had eternal light or glory or like different radiance. So one says, the faithful will have glory for eternal light. The next speaks of God clothing the righteous with light. And then Song of the Sabbath Sacrifice describes angels clothed in luminous glory. And by participation, humans are envisioned joining in that radiance. Philo of Alexandria describes the wise soul as radiant, reflecting the divine light and universalizing Moses' glow so any soul filled with divine wisdom can shine with radiance. The Leviticus Rabbah says that the righteous in the age to come will shine like the sun, borrowing from Daniel 12:3. And then Cody, to me, has that radiance sometimes. And there's even times when I'm talking to people, specifically when I've talked to people at our old church about dreams that I've had, God has warned me against trusting their interpretation because they glowed an odd color. So like I could see that their hands looked like they were glowing purple, and that was like a warning sign to me. Don't trust this interpretation. So I feel like there's enough historically and biblically to believe that somebody who's wise and somebody who's righteous, whether it's by a glow like Moses where he had to wear a veil, or a glow just like a simple radiance from within that you can tell that God is with them. Either way, it doesn't really matter if it was visible or invisible. What matters is that he was being wise and righteous and he was honoring God. And so he had God's steadfast love and blessing because of that attitude. He set his face on God, just like Numbers, may the Lord make his face shine upon you. When your face is set on God, you're reflecting God out into the world. And I think that's what we're seeing here.
Yeah, and even in New Testament thought, I love that because like we are told to be the light of the world. We're told to light up the darkness, and it's not of our own light, it's of God's, that we're this radiant representation of his presence to others, and that's what we're supposed to do. I love that.
Yep.
It feels in many ways like Joseph's relationship with God is closer to that of the more modern Christian. And it's very strange because when you compare his relationship to that of his father or his grandfather or his great-grandfather, the relationship's completely different. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob got to know God in a personal way. Abraham met with him physically many times, in fact. Jacob met with him a few times. Isaac, we don't know exactly how many times he met with him physically or saw him, but like he saw enough to where the fear of Isaac is something that you swear on. So by comparison, Joseph, his relationship is a lot more mundane. It's believable. It's comprehensible to us because most of it is just he has dreams, he interprets dreams, he gets understanding from God, and so he's able to interpret things. And we also see this, that God gives him success. God gives him wisdom in the everyday life, which we don't quite see in his father or grandfather or great-grandfather. We see that he gets general success. We see that in his service to other people, God's light shines through him.
And it's important to remember here, just for relatability, that Joseph was well within his rights to hate his life. Like he should have been wrestling like Jacob did. Joseph should have really struggled with this crazy demotion and being sold by his brothers and really screwed over. I don't know how else to put it. His status went from the leader of his family under his father to being nothing. And instead of choosing to be the guy that cleaned the toilets and being really angry or whatever, he got elevated over and over in that humility. And I think he would have had to have made a conscious effort. Look, I'm motivated. I'm going to continue to honor the Lord. And that's so hard to focus on when you're angry and you feel like things aren't going your way.
Yeah, because if we look at his story that we've had thus far, like he was blessed and highly favored in his household and his clan that he was in, obviously elevated to a higher status than that of his brothers and clearly the favorite. And we do see him getting elevated here, but it didn't start that way. He had to start from the bottom and work his way up. It says that he became successful, implying that there was a process to that success. It wasn't instantaneous. I do think it shows his character a little bit of where it could still be pride. I'm better than this, so he fights through it, but it also could be just obedience to the situation that he's in, and that with this chapter, a little bit more of him giving honor to God and the presence of God with him through this situation.
In a few generations, you have this example of Saul. And that's who I think of in this story of like how Joseph could have become. He could have become this twisted, demented, angry wretch who just did whatever he thought he had to do to get ahead. And he didn't here. And still God blessed him and showed favor on him. I think if he were being angry and prideful, then he would have made himself God's enemy and he wouldn't have received the gift of steadfast love and blessing. So I think that's evidence in and of itself. And then we know that he's still angry because when his brothers come to Egypt and he arrests one of them for stealing, we know that he's still got bitterness, but that doesn't stop God. God's okay, have your feelings, wrestle with this, but also be obedient. And he is.
None of us is perfect.
No.
And that's the big thing that the Bible constantly reinforces over and over again, even for the people who are called righteous. And there's a pretty rich diversity of people in the Bible who are labeled as righteous. They're not all the type of stereotypical righteous we think of. Usually when we think of righteousness, we think of Joseph because we don't see him mess up a lot. But that's not really what God considers righteous. The righteous are those who live by faith, who believe in God, and thus he credits to them righteousness. And we see that Joseph acts out his belief in God, his faith in God, by being faithful even in this low position. And you touched on something important, Cody. This, I think, is 10 years that he spends with Potiphar, being his slave. We don't know how much of that he spent at the very bottom, basically just mopping floors, no shirt on, no nothing. He's half naked, walking around. He's basically an object, a tool. He's not a person while he's in that stage. Eventually he graduates to that, but how long? Who knows? But it's clear that he got to where he was because even at the lowest position, he chose to be faithful. And that's hard for any of us. Like when we're mistreated at work, when we're like, it's for work we're getting paid for, even when someone is mean to us, or we really struggle, or work gets really difficult, it's hard for any of us. I know it's hard for me to just, you know what? God put me here. I'm going to be a blessing to everyone, and I'm just going to keep going. And that's what he chose to do.
I see this relating really well to this idea of spiritual giftedness and how some of us are blessed with this good, strong, firm, rooted faith that doesn't get easily shaken. I'm not one of those people. I envy Joseph here because I wish that I had the spiritual gift of faith and that I could trust that openly. It's very hard for me. And I wanted to take a second because Cody's been working really hard on our website. Cody has been working on some assessments and some different things. And so if you are listening and you're like, man, that doesn't sound like me either. If you want to know what your spiritual gifts are, come and try out our new beta assessment and send us feedback and what you think. And if you want to connect about that, we would love to hear how our listeners feel their faith and other gifts could be developed further. Because I definitely, in reading this chapter, have felt like I've fallen short a little bit in my faith.
And for those of you who don't know, our website is thelogicofgod.com.
Yay.
So yeah, go there. You can take the different assessments we have there. We have one on spiritual gifts. We have one on deconstruction.
And more to come. There's a limitless pit of things that we have in the works, but we have some regulars we don't hear from. One in Australia, another one I think in Sri Lanka.
Singapore too.
In Singapore. And then there's one in, is it Tel Aviv? No, there's another one in the Asian area, Eastern Asia. Can't remember. There was some in Dubai for a while, but I don't know. But we haven't heard from you guys, and we have a lot of tools and even more tools to come. So if you are interested, visit our website, check us out. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, and we are working on bringing even more spiritual resources, counseling, different things to our listeners. We care about you, and we want to hear from you. So that's my plug. Anyway, Joseph was put in charge of the household and all that his master had. So why would God bless a pagan for Joseph's sake? That seems like a little over the top.
Yeah, I think this is following the covenantal promise to Abraham. Like, I will bless those who bless you. Like, you can clearly sees the blessing of God on Joseph and capitalizes on that for his own sake and is blessed because of that. The covenantal promise was, I'll bless those who bless you, and those who dishonor you will not be blessed. I see this as following God's covenantal promise to Abraham of those who treat you well, I'll treat well, and those who don't, I won't.
In many ways, it points to the fact that we are living testaments to God, that through us, God is able to enact blessing. And if you reject his blessing, then you reject goodness. You reject all that comes with it. Not to go into too much detail, Cody, you were working at a place a while back, and you were giving them everything that you had, and you were working as unto the Lord. You're doing the best, absolute best that you could, and you were providing a lot of wealth for them because of that. And then you ended up getting kicked out.
It was a layoff. I mean, it had nothing to do with his performance.
But for no real good reason, and then they suffered for it. Like, they were being blessed even though they didn't deserve it, and they were being blessed because you were acting in a way that is in accordance with what God wants, what God asks of us. So people who don't deserve it will often be blessed because we're doing things as we would to God. And then when we're not around anymore, because either we're taken advantage of or we're kicked out or something, and in this case, Joseph is accused falsely, and Potiphar doesn't stand with him for good, understandable reasons we'll get to, but not good necessarily. But once you reject God's blessings, you're rejecting God. And so I would argue that in many ways, Potiphar, though he has understandable reasons for what he does, ultimately rejects God's blessing as well.
It's that same kind of fear of Jacob. What will they say? What will they think? So moving on to the next verses. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her to lie beside her or be with her. So this is interesting because I hear all the time how Joseph is a Christological figure, like his whole story aligns with Christ's story. But this is a dichotomy here. He was beautiful to look at, and Jesus was specifically ugly. So I found that notable.
I think that's another reason why Cody's analysis a couple episodes ago was interesting, that Joseph seems to embody two different paths. There is the Christological path, but there's also the path of the devil himself. Now, that sounds really awful, but when you think about who the devil was before the fall, he wasn't inherently evil from the start. And so, in many ways, Joseph parallels who he was and who he was meant to be before he fell off. And we see, as the story progresses, the risk and the threat of pride on those who are born with great beauty, great power, great ability. It's interesting there, like, you see the sheer number of Christians, like really famous Christian apologists or people in the Christian world who have great charisma, great ability, and are sometimes handsome, sometimes not, but are gifted with great success and wealth. And then almost all of them end terribly. Almost all of them have their own miniature fall, their rebellion against God. Ravi Zacharias is an incredibly apt comparison here. He wasn't super beautiful or anything, but he became very famous and very wealthy. And he had a horrendous falling where he gave in to sexual temptation many more times and in terrible ways. And so we see the problem of pride. These men, generally, I do believe, started out with the best of intentions, and we see Joseph here display the best of intentions. But temptation does eventually take its toll. And for the proud, temptation is especially harsh because you think, why should I say no? Why should I deny myself this? I deserve it. And we see a different kind of temptation that seems to take a hold of Joseph, which is revenge.
Yeah. He doesn't seem to care that he's good looking. He cares about other things. But revenge is something that I think he holds closer to his heart than his looks.
Throughout this chapter, like throughout Joseph's story, he seems to be increasing his self-control. I don't know if you could say that with his lack of intuition on how his brothers perceived him and the things that he ended up saying. I wouldn't say that would be great self-control of the mouth, knowing they disliked you and still continuing on. But you see this self-control for a goal for Joseph here. And this is emphasized in the Testament of the 12, which I'll have a couple touch points.
I think he's exercising meekness. He has the ability to, he's got a lot of blessing. He has the ability to use that authority in a wrong way, but he's choosing not to. So it's not with violence. It's not meekness with violence and stuff. But looking at Joseph's brothers, they got angry about Dinah and killed all the men. As opposed to Joseph, who's, don't sin against God, but I'm not going to do anything that you want me to do here. And it's like a weird mirror.
It's also interesting, you can still see some of Joseph's pride in the way he responds to Potiphar's wife here. In verse 9, where he says, "He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept anything from me except you." He's putting himself above Potiphar here. Even in the original Hebrew, if you read it as directly one for one, there is no one greater in this house than I. So you can still see there is some pride here. Now, he's pointing this out to rebut Potiphar's wife. And basically he's saying, I have the authority to say no. I have the authority to put this distance between the two of us. I am even in many ways greater than my own master. But the motivation is one thing. The fact is he's still in a way boasting in his response here.
Yeah. He's not, I'm so hot, though. He's just, I have power. So Joseph doesn't specifically say no to her here, which I find really interesting as a slave. And I know Cody had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting that he doesn't say no here. He ends up with a rebuttal of why, like a reasoning as to why, like it's almost a legal rebuttal as to why he shouldn't have relations with someone who technically owns him as a slave. And throughout A&E, Roman, like any cultural slavery, sexual slavery was very prevalent. It's not talked about very often, but that is something that came with slavery. They had rights to every aspect of the slave. So technically, in this situation, I do think that she had the authority to sleep with him, but he is making a legal rebuttal as to why that shouldn't take place.
Okay, so I wrote down some questions, and I know, Ben, I know your thoughts a little bit, but we'll flesh it out and see where we go. So is he warning her about his God or her gods? And if she's being warned about his gods, why should she care?
So the word that he uses here for God is Elohim. And so because Elohim is both singular and plural, singular in the sense that it's the name for God is in our God, Yahweh. It's one of the names for him, and it's used frequently throughout the Old Testament and especially in Genesis. Because that can be plural, it's possible to argue grammatically he could be saying that this would be a sin against the gods. And Cody, you'd mentioned before, there are ways in which this is potentially a sin for the Egyptians to do as well, because she's married and she shouldn't be doing this. And so it would, since marriages are done in the eyes of the gods, it would also be a sin against the gods. However, there are usually ways in which the phrase would be written to make it clear that it's other gods, as in it's not God himself. They would usually say your gods or the other gods or something like that, because it's specifically just Elohim by itself. Generally, it's accepted that this is God as in Yahweh. Now, you may ask, why doesn't he just say Yahweh then? Because God's name as Yahweh has not been revealed yet. That actually happens in Exodus, several hundred years after this. That's when God tells Moses to say, tell them I am has sent you, or tell them he is has sent you. So they don't really know his name at this point, and that's why they call him God, just like we do. So I know it's a little confusing, but there are future points where it's completely unambiguous, and Joseph is absolutely saying God's name as Elohim, and we know that because it's conjugated with singular verbs. So even though Elohim can be plural, it's a singular verb. That means it's the God, it's Yahweh, and it's the singular verb attributing a singular action to him. Here, it's a bit ambiguous, but I would argue it's him.
Yeah, I would say Joseph has no reason to adhere to any other god. So when he says it, he would mean Yahweh. But with knowing any culture, and
which is ancient Near East.
Yeah, ancient Near East culture. This was even something that Egyptian culture shied away from. We also see in what would be talked about in Egyptian culture back when Abraham and Sarah had to sojourn because of a famine in the land and went down to Egypt. And Pharaoh took Sarah, who he thought was Abraham's sister, and that ended poorly. He realized that it was a sin. God afflicted him, and there was plagues that came with him taking Sarah as a wife. But as soon as he realized that was the case, he's like, why did you lie to me? Why did you tell me it was your sister and not your wife? Take her and leave. Like he was frustrated that this happened. You have some other context in scripture where I think even if Joseph was clearly talking Yahweh, it would still resonate with Potiphar's wife, just because this is a common thing that like you don't mess with other people's wives.
And it could be some literary devices used by the author of Genesis. But I also think it's interesting that Pharaoh specifically asks for someone who the Ruach Elohim, the breath of God, lies on. That's a very Hebrew understanding of the Spirit of God, or the breath of God. And the fact that Pharaoh uses it assuming he actually says that, because there's always the possibility it's a turn of phrase. But it's possible he used it, and if he did, it means that they had an understanding of God and who he was back at this point. They may have started straying into other gods, and we saw that with folks like Laban or other people in Jacob's camp. There was a kind of straying into the worship of angels as gods and things like that at this time period. But it's also possible that at this point they still had some comprehension of the true God, and so had some understanding of who he was and his importance.
Yeah, I think this ties in too, because like back in verse 2, it says the Lord was with Joseph. And there's lots of Jewish tradition about that's the spirit of Yahweh resting on Joseph right there. And even the Targum Onkelos connects that same phrase to the Logos, the word. You have the Logos present here in this as well in Targum Onkelos. I do think that is very interesting.
I think, to me, the thing that's confusing is why he would expect Potiphar's wife to care that she's sinning against a God she doesn't worship. And I think the reason that I feel that way is because Potiphar saw the Lord's blessing on Joseph and trusted him immensely because of it. And so my question is, when does trust become belief and then faith and then allegiance? At what point does this translate into converting from one religion to the Hebrew religion or Christianity ultimately? And I think that's a point that I want to make, because this is like a New Testament comparison. But when you have, I can't remember the Pharisee's name, with Jesus who like wanted
Nicodemus.
Yeah, Nicodemus. It reminds me of Nicodemus because he was curious enough to know, okay, this is true, but he wasn't brave enough to go counterculture and actually follow it. And I see that here with Potiphar a little bit, and I think this is why Potiphar doesn't kill Joseph for the accusations that are made. He knows that God is with him, and he doesn't want to trample that, but he also can't really afford to be different than his own civilization. So that's the point I wanted to make, is just at what point does this faith that Potiphar has and what's happening for Joseph, when does he absorb that as his own and make it his own and develop that relationship, even though the Old Testament God was a little different? So that's my question.
Yeah, I do think this as the reason or legal rebuttal for Potiphar's wife as well is, look at me, like this God, my God, is the one who has prospered this household. Like I am set above in this household because of the God that I serve. And to do this would be sinning against him and revoke basically everything that Potiphar has seen in me and what I have brought to this household because I serve the real God.
And yeah, it's interesting you bring up that Potiphar, again, we'll get to it in a little bit, but there's a specific way that Potiphar reacts to the accusations of his wife. And we can argue he doesn't believe them, or he recognizes that God is with Joseph and so doesn't want to kill him. But in the end, it's clear that there was a different action he should have taken. He should have absolutely stood with Joseph and absolutely gone against his wife and absolutely gone against the expectations of his culture. And he doesn't do that. That would have been an act of faith to God, the true God, the God that is with Joseph. And he had greater fear of he who was in the world than he who was with Joseph. He had a greater fear of the reaction of his wife, his culture, his people, the scandal that would have come about in his household. Too many worldly concerns and not enough concern about God. And so I agree. I think he recognizes the power of God through Joseph, and he enjoys the benefits of that. But when it finally comes time for it to cost him something, he says no. So I wouldn't call him a believer in God at all.
No, he's not to allegiance.
No.
And that's the true faith, I think.
I agree. There is this big discussion that's been going on in the Christian church of faith as allegiance versus faith as in kind of awareness or belief. The Bible says that even demons believe in God and shudder. I don't think there's a very strong case you can make that faith in God is simply acknowledging his existence or believing his existence. I do genuinely believe faith is much more akin to allegiance. Joseph shows allegiance. And I think both sides of that allegiance are very clearly shown in the story. Joseph, despite the fact he knows it's going to cost him something, refuses to cave in and chooses to honor God. Potiphar doesn't do that. In the end, he caves because it will cost him too much to stand and side with Joseph, to stand and side with God. And so he ends up siding against Joseph. Now, he's still somewhat merciful. By worldly standards, I would say he's actually pretty merciful to Joseph. And again, we'll get into that. But as far as actually aligning himself with God, would you do this if it was God himself? If you truly believed that someone had God on their side, was acting with God's authority, would you do this to them? I would say no.
I would agree. So verse 11, but one day when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, see, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, the Hebrew servant, whom you have brought among us, came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house. So, because she got rejected, she cornered him when they were alone together, took off his garment, and he ran away. And then she accused him of attempted assault, if not just total assault.
And she brings the attention of the whole house. It specifically says she calls to the men of the house. She brings everyone in. She makes a massive scene. And she does this with intent. It's not that she just waits to quietly speak to her husband about this. She stages the scene. She puts the garment next to her, and she keeps it with her until the husband is there. She brings everyone in. She wails so loud that everyone can hear. She's basically making it to where her husband's hand is going to be forced against Joseph when he gets back.
Yeah, so there's a lot here for me, and some of the extra biblical on this expands. Like one of pseudepigraphal books or works that I like is actually the Testament of the 12. So the Testament of the 12 is Second Temple literature, is where it's dated around 200 BC in that time frame, give or take a couple hundred years. But it is a testament from the tellings of the 12 patriarchs, Joseph being one of those patriarchs. It's very Jewish in nature. It has Joseph. So a testament would just be basically when you're on your deathbed, you gather your family around and you tell them what you've learned out of your life. Joseph's instance of his retelling of his testament is his self-control. It goes through the story with Potiphar's wife actually being several instances. You get a couple in the Bible, but I think there's 6 or 7 instances that Potiphar's wife tempts him in this testament, and more elaborate each time. So she, in the beginning, is just coercing him, treating him like a son because he's younger than her, and then he finds out that she's getting close to him with the intent to sleep with him, and nips that in the bud. And then she comes back again with different ploys. It escalates until I think the final one where she's like enchanting food and doing different types of like spiritual warfare involving the gods that she worships into different talismans or items to promote a spiritual battle and tempt Joseph in this way. Which I think adding the layer of spiritual warfare into this and how this is, and Jewish tradition also connects this to the serpent's tempting of the fruit in a similar way, and how Adam and Eve didn't succeed, Joseph succeeds. And also connects, I think I spoke about it back when we were covering Abraham, but like 10 tests. That's very common in Jewish tradition of 10 tests of the patriarchs. It goes through Joseph's 10 tests and Potiphar's wife being one of those and how he prevails.
I love that. I love the work you did on that because it all connects back. Like you can see the oral tradition like surviving, but also you can see all of the patterns emerging.
One of the instances with the enchantments right after, during that one is when Joseph's rebuttal with this is a sin against God. And so she rebuts that as if you would just sleep with me, I would reject all my gods, all my idols, and come worship your God. If you just, and that's where like the crux of the spiritual warfare is. I'll submit to your side if you just submit to me here. And obviously he doesn't succumb to that and continues on with getting thrown in prison.
He didn't go, I can fix her.
Yeah, he's like, she just needs a little work. She's a bit of a fixer-upper.
So what about this garment? You know what? It's like a weird word. We had a coat. We've heard of a lot of different clothing related items. Garment, though, is vague. It could be pants. It could be a shirt. What is it? Is it the manna of clothing? We don't know what it is. I happen to think it has something to do with his loincloth.
It probably is, because I don't think he was wearing much else.
Yeah.
And this would also lend very well to the idea that she's saying he tried to rape me, basically. And so the proof is the loincloth. So, one, he probably wasn't wearing much else, being a slave, even the master slave of the household, basically. He probably was not wearing much. We see in a lot of the pictures that the Egyptians drew, like we see that they're generally depicted as just having the waistband.
Like a skirt.
Yeah, like a skirt. So it makes sense to me. It's a bit of an assumption, but it does make sense to me given the pictures that we have and everything. And the fact that he was a slave, he probably got that grabbed. Like she was grabbing at him. He ran. And then that's all that was left behind.
Yeah, the Testament of the 12 would also confirm that. It said he fled naked. Even ancient Jewish folk believed it was also his loincloth, or at least his entire covering, that he had to flee naked.
So this is the second garment that he's been humiliated in. And I found that really interesting. So I fell into a rabbi hole, as Ben likes to say. And I discovered some cool parallels between Joseph and Christ. Joseph had 2 garments that humbled him and 2 that glorified him. So the 2 garments that he was humbled in were his many-colored coat and then his garment, probably loincloth. And then after this, there's 2 more garments that we hear about for him, which I won't share on yet. So you can research that yourself or wait until we cover that in the future episode. But Christ also has 4 garments mentioned. Actually, Christ has 5 mentioned, but one of them is just the fact that he's not wearing his clothes when they discover the empty tomb. So I don't count that as like the same. I think it's like an extra add-on showing that the miracle of Jesus's resurrection sets him apart from Joseph. So it's one of those things that they have so much in common, and yet the story is flipped for Jesus and Joseph. It's the first 2 for Joseph humble him, the second 2 glorify him, and it's opposite for Jesus. So I find it just really interesting pattern, something that is worth playing around with in your mind, because we all wear different coats. It's like that saying, oh, I'm wearing 10 different hats and I'm pulled in 10 different directions. I have my mom hat and I have my business person hat and I have my homemaker hat and my stewardship hat and my church leader hat and all of that podcast hat. We all have these different garments throughout these seasons of our lives. And it's not really our choice sometimes what happens to us as a result. And I think Joseph here shows so much grace and humility compared to where he's been. And this is one of those signs that he's probably becoming ready for the next layers of leadership, which we see him get in this chapter, but also it continues to grow. And I don't think God would have continued to bless and love him the way that he was if he had allowed the garment coming off to seal his fate.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting way of looking at it. Like, when he had his multicolored coat taken away, that's basically him losing his family, his status, the home that he loved, and that was symbolically him leaving his old life behind and everything that came with it. The cushy life that he had's now gone. But he still had something. Like, he still had his dignity.
Yeah, his underwear.
And at this point, yeah, you could argue he left with his underwear. And now even that, he's basically, like you said, Cody, in the Testament of Joseph, he flees naked. He's basically being thrown into prison naked. The lowest levels of society, treated as a criminal, and he has literally nothing, not even an undergarment to call his. And so that is in some ways humiliating, but it's also humbling. It's a further measure of humbling. And You may say, I don't think he needs it. He was already a slave for a long time and he was still making the best of that situation. I've noticed that God tends to push the extremes a bit when he's going to do something great through someone. Like we saw this with Abraham. You would think surely he doesn't need to wait till he's 100 years old. He doesn't need to wait till Sarah's 90. But he really pushed that. Already when he got those promises, he was pretty old. And then it was pushed to the point where he was obscenely old. There was just no way he could have kids with Sarah. And then he does. We see with Elijah on Mount Carmel. It would have been an incredible thing just by itself to send a fire from heaven. But what does Elijah do? He digs a pit around the sacrificial altar, and he pours water all over the sacrifice. He fills up the pit, the trench, until it's overflowing, and he goes past the point of overflowing. It's already redundant. It's already absurd. Everything's soaking wet, and then God destroys everything, including the rocks and the water. This is what God does, and he doesn't just do it symbolically through things like altars and sacrifices. In many ways, we are the sacrifice. We are the testament. Our lives are the testimony to God. And so we shouldn't be surprised when God does extreme things to us so that he can do extreme things through us.
The garments with this one, it just makes me mad because all of Jewish tradition connects it to Adam. This was, again, Adam's garment symbolically and the dominion that came with. And I started to get into that a little bit more just because, like, why does every garment have to be Adam's in Jewish tradition? And it wasn't Jewish tradition that led me this way, but I like the idea of the stripping of the garments because there's this passage in Zechariah, and I'll read it and then expand a little bit. So Zechariah 3:1-5. Then he showed me Joshua, the high priest, standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. And the Lord said to Satan, "The Lord rebuke you, O Satan. The Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is not this a brand plucked from the fire?" Now Joshua was standing before the angel, clothed with filthy garments. And the angel said to those who were standing before him, "Remove the filthy garments from him." And he said, "Behold, I have taken your iniquity away from you, and I will clothe you with pure vestments." And I said, "Let them put a clean turban on his head." So they put a clean turban on his head and clothed him with garments, and the angel of the Lord was standing by. So I think this is more of that legal speak in the Bible. Like you have these, and the connection with Adam, the dominion that comes with, and Satan trying to usurp that and take that dominion. And we see that he uses that to tempt Jesus later in the wilderness. I have dominion over the earth. Like I will give you the kingdoms of the earth. Satan has taken that. And you have this status that Joseph has gotten, and that is stripped away from him. And we know the Lord was with him through this. And I think a lot of that connects to, we will be stripped of what we consider good. This was a good position that Joseph had with both the rainbow coat and whether this was a robe or a garment, a loincloth, like it was a position that he had that was stripped away and filthy rags so that he could later be clothed with those pure vestments, those righteous vestments that God will put on him. And like where we think we can have excelled or grown, like the status of the rainbow coat or the multicolored garment or the status of being high in the household of Potiphar, is just filthy rags compared to where God is going to end up putting us. And I think you can see Satan's play here a little bit, especially with Potiphar, and looking at this as temptation, as this is a status, like you submit to me and you will continue on in your position here. And he has to be humbled again, not necessarily because he was prideful in this instance, but that was taken away, and God puts a better vestment on him later.
He has to wait for it.
Yep.
And I think that's why we all stamp our feet and we're like, grr, no.
Things are always so good right now.
Yeah.
Why do you have to take away the thing that's good right now? I'm a slave in another man's house, but it's stable, it's good, it's a good life, I'm provided for, I am the highest slave. Why you got to take this away from me?
Yeah, but you're still a slave, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, we're just wallowing in our own filth and we're like, God, don't lift us up out of that. We're too comfortable.
Yeah, laugh here also stood out to me.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I forgot. I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, what does she mean that she keeps saying they're laughing at her? Is she just that embarrassed that she was rejected?
No, so this is a euphemism for sexual intercourse. So this word here, laugh, that she says this Hebrew boy, Joseph, came in.
Is this like the mules?
No.
Sorry.
No, this isn't like an idiom. This is like a turn of phrase for Hebrew and why background study and not just take it like laugh. If you read this in English, you're like, okay, that doesn't make sense, but okay. But this is the same word that is used of Isaac and Rebecca when they're being playful. So it's also translated as play and laugh. We missed that earlier. We thought he was just being cute and playful. It's a euphemism for marital relations, or what should be marital relations.
Enjoying one another's company.
Yes.
Bow, chicka, bow, bow.
Yeah. And one of the things, the connections that I like of this that I'm excited to cover is like the golden calf story. After that, it says that they ate and drank wine and they were playful. And that's always been weird to me, but it makes more sense now and why that's
Why God was
cult
killing
practices.
people?
And, yeah, why it was so bad. They're participating. So this could be like the mules in the sense that they might have been trying to make those hybrids.
It's not so much a mistranslation of a word as just a misunderstanding of a euphemism.
Correct.
Cody has a great book on that.
Yeah. Jewish idioms.
Yeah.
I don't know the author. It's up there somewhere.
Yeah. Okay. Let's finish out this chapter. So, as soon as his master heard the words that his wife had spoken to him, "This is the way your servant treated me," his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. You mean to tell me that a prisoner became the jailer while being a prisoner? It's like another layer of slavery here.
And it does seem weird. It's so Potiphar's wife tells Potiphar that a slave attempted to rape her, or actually did rape her. And his response to this is to put him not just in any prison, but in the prison specifically that is reserved for the prisoners of Pharaoh. And then the jailer respects this dude so much that he lets him be put in charge of all the prisoners, even though this is a dude that raped an official that works under Pharaoh directly. That seems a bit odd.
Very much.
But it makes sense if Potiphar doesn't believe his wife. And I would argue he probably doesn't. It does say that he was angry, and I have no doubt he was angry. I imagine he was very angry at the situation. But it doesn't say that he was angry with Joseph. And realistically, if he believed his wife, he should have just straight up killed Joseph, because that would have been the proper penalty for doing this. We see Judah react in this very similar fashion for something much less. We see Simeon and Levi act in a much worse way against an entire nation of people.
But then you have Jacob who's, "Oh, you made me stink to the people." And that's exactly what's happening here. I can't kill you because you're innocent, but I got to do something for cred.
Yeah, I think that I don't think he believed his wife. And
it's that or he feared the Lord. He just wasn't loyal to the Lord.
That's possible. Either is possible. But I think it's probably both there.
Yeah, so he's just trying to save face. With all of the other servants, he can't not do anything. Otherwise, they might try to attempt what Joseph's being accused of. And if he had no action, then he would be seen as weak to everybody around if the accusations were true, or he would have had to kill his wife.
And no matter what, it looks bad.
Yeah.
If it was Joseph's loincloth that was taken, they would have found Joseph naked. And Potiphar's wife was the one holding it, and she makes a stink immediately after this happens. She yells to everybody. And it specifically says she brings in the men of the house. She brings in as many people as she can. She tells as many people as possible. She lays down weeping with the loincloth until her husband gets back. She's making it as clear as possible to as much of the household that something bad has happened and Joseph is responsible. So at this point, yeah, for Potiphar, it's like, it doesn't matter if he believes her or not. He's got to do something.
Yeah, it's a tough situation for him, because if he does nothing, he has to admit that his wife is trying to have relations outside of him, which...
That's emasculating.
Yeah, in any situation, that's emasculating. So if he admits that fully, then he has to live with that.
And he's a soldier. This is not the Isaac of Egypt. This is like the Esau of Egypt. He's a warrior. He's a man's man. He's a fighter. He works for the Pharaoh. He's the head of the guard. Like, he has a high status and he has to look like a man.
Even though, because I think it's pretty strong case can be made he doesn't believe his wife, he should have still sided with Joseph. He should have sided with the innocent man. And while he is merciful in many ways, because he could have done a lot worse in the situation, and instead he tries to put him in basically the best of the prison. Like, I think that's what this means. It's saying that he's putting him in the place where Pharaoh kind of keeps people. Like, we see he puts his baker and his wine taster, and he may throw people here on a whim who he may forgive later. So this isn't the worst prison ever.
No, this was historically considered to be more of an administrative building or office than like a pit in the dirt. In the movie, he's in like a dirt pit with bars on everything. It wasn't like that. It was very much an administrative thing. And like, according to Babylonian and ancient Near East texts, they were considered like trustees in the jail. So people who were educated were given tasks and projects and things that they could still do. Just like when you read Paul, like Paul had the ability to write all of these letters from prison. He wasn't just chained to a wall with skeletons around him. Like, jail to them meant something different than what it means to us.
And when you look at it that way, it actually makes a lot of sense why the jailer would actually give everything to Joseph, because Joseph was educated. Joseph was already doing administrative tasks. And so if God is with him, he has a chance to shine. And so you can see, oh, he's like really good at this stuff. Just give everything to him.
Yeah.
And yeah, I would assume there's some history. So if he was running the third in command of Pharaoh's nation, like, he could probably handle the tasks of a prison.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. That's it. That's this chapter. The next chapter, he has dreams again, and we will get into those, but it's not his dreams that he's interpreting, it's someone else. And so you see even more character development. And I think it's going to be fun to finish out this story.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed going through Joseph's story for the first time with a real fine-tooth comb, because I didn't really think there was that much development in Joseph's character, and it feels like there actually is a lot going on with him. It's just, it's not as clear from a lot of the popular interpretations that we see of him.
No, they like to think of him as righteous before having started this journey. There's no development. There's no progression at all. He was started righteous, he ended righteous. Not a whole lot to this story. We're good.
I think there's chronic infantilization of Joseph. Like, he's this sweet, innocent, snowy white young boy. And this is clear character development here. He's become a man to the point where he's being sexually pursued by somebody. It's just, you have so many signs of that growth. And for another Vacation Bible School story, like, we're reclaiming that. So I'm grateful. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to our podcast today. If you liked what you heard, please feel free to subscribe and share and leave a positive review. And if you would like to connect with us on social media, you can do so on Instagram and Facebook at The Logic of God. You can also send us an email at main.thelogicofgod@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening. We hope you have a great day.